a 19-year-old lieutenant against 47 steel monsters of the Wehrmacht. 4 tanks, and an order to stand to the death in an open field. Dig in? No. Sorov decides otherwise, and this decision nearly sends him to a court-martial. Inside the machines, it is hell. The heat melts skin, fans circulate carbon monoxide, loaders faint from heat stroke, and the smell of burnt rubber and human flesh becomes unbearable. German gunners lose their minds, screaming about dancing ghosts. How did he force an armada to retreat? What is hidden behind this dance, where a 1-second error equals instant death? The most grueling details, the scandalous finale, and the truth that was hidden for decades, only at the end. Watch until the end, and you will understand why even today at West Point, they draw this very diagram. The ground didn't just tremble. It hummed at a low frequency that vibrated through the diaphragm and made teeth ache. It was the physics of approaching mass. Thousands of tons of Krupp steel, multiplied by diesel traction, were grinding the dry-as-gunpowder steppe near Stalingrad. On August 23, 1942, the air over the Kotlub collective farm became as thick as jelly. It hung heavy with dust, the smell of burnt diesel, and the metallic taste of inevitability. 19-year-old Lieutenant Alexander Sorov looked through the vision block of his commander's cupola. The glass was cloudy, with a layer of soot. He wiped it with the sleeve of his oily tunic, leaving a dirty smear. Ahead, on the horizon, a grey wall was rising. It wasn't smoke. It was the exhaust of the tank armada of the 14th Corps of the Wehrmacht. Intelligence had reported dry numbers that sounded like a field tribunal sentence. 47 pennants. 47 German machines against his 4 T-34s. The math of war that day was working against them. The equation was simple and deadly. The force ratio was nearly 12-to-1. According to all tactical standards and field manuals, this meant one thing: total annihilation of the defenders within 6 to 8 minutes of direct fire contact. That was exactly how much time German gunners needed to zero in on stationary targets with their Zeiss optics. Sorov dropped down inside the turret. Here, in the enclosed space, the temperature had already passed 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The ventilation couldn't keep up. The V2 engine, idling, drove heat through the bulkhead, turning the fighting compartment into a sauna, only instead of steam, there was carbon monoxide. The lieutenant looked at his crew. The loader, a burly man with hairy arms, sat staring at the breech of the gun. Rivulets of sweat ran down his face, mixing with dirt, turning his face into a black mask. These men were older than him. The driver, Gromov, probably had children back home the same age as Sorov himself.
"Lieutenant!" Gromov's voice in the headset sounded hollow, with static interference. "The ground is shaking. There's a lot of them." "I see them," Sorov snapped briefly. His voice was dry, devoid of intonation. Emotions right now were just extra ballast. Only calculation mattered. The order from headquarters was unequivocal. Block the road. Stand to the death. In military terminology, stand to the death usually implied digging in, creating hull-down positions, and turning the tank into a pillbox. But Sorov had the mind of an engineer, not just a soldier. He understood the mechanics of armor penetration. If they dug the tanks in, they would turn into stationary targets. A stationary tank for a long-barreled German Panzer IV is just a training target on a range. A 75mm shell would punch through the frontal armor of a T-34 if it just sat there waiting. Sorov closed his eyes for a second, visualizing the map of the terrain. Steppe. Flat as an ironing board. No ravines, no tree lines, no folds in the ground to hide a 30-ton machine. There was no cover. It was a chessboard where the white pieces were already set up, and the black pieces, his platoon, were in a stalemate before the first move. The manual demanded suicide. Logic demanded action. Static crackled in the headphones. The airwaves were silent, but it was a heavy silence. German pedantry, their famous Ordnung, implied movement on a schedule. They weren't going into an attack. They were going to a parade. They knew there was no one here but a handful of suicide troops. Sorov felt time compressing. Every second the enemy column approached took away options for survival. "Check the breach," he commanded, checking the connection. Armor piercing in the ready rack close to hand. Stow the high explosives deep. He understood they wouldn't need high explosive shells today. There would be no one to cut off infantry, and no need. This would be a duel of armor and kinetic energy. Just steel against steel. The lieutenant climbed out of the hatch to gulp some hot, dusty air. The silence before battle pressed on the eardrums harder than the roar of artillery. He saw commanders peeking out of the hatches of neighboring machines, their postures red of doom. They were waiting for the order to dig. They were waiting for the order to die. In their understanding, war was a simple exchange. Their lives, in exchange for delaying the German advance by half an hour. That was the price of infantry time. But tankers knew the price of their machines. A tank is a complex mechanism, a resource that cannot be burned talentlessly. The wind drove tumbleweeds across the steppe. Dry grass rustled against the tracks. The sound was irritating. Sorov looked at his hands. They weren't shaking. There was no fear as such. There was a cold, sticky realization that in 10 minutes, his body could turn into a charred piece of organic matter mixed with molten metal. This wasn't philosophy. It was thermodynamics. The burning temperature of a thermite shell is thousands of degrees. The chances of surviving in a steel box when the ammo rack detonates are 0.0. He dropped back down to the levers and sights. The smell of grease, sweat, and heated metal hit his nose. The smell of home. The smell of war. "Listen to my order," he said into the throat microphone, switching the radio to the general platoon frequency. "No trenches. Do not kill the engines. Keep revs at idle warmth." A pause hung in the ether. It was heavier than the drone of German motors. Violation of regulations. Court-martial. Execution. But the execution would be later, if they survived. The German slugs would arrive now. "Comrade Lieutenant," the voice of the 2nd Tank's commander, Sergeant Petrov, wavered. "We have instructions." "We'll be sitting ducks. Belay instructions." Sorov's voice became hard as the clang of a bolt carrier. Instructions were written by those currently in the rear. "I am here, and I say, to stand is to die. We will not be targets." He imagined the battle schematic, vectors of movement, ballistics. German tanks are heavy. Their turrets rotate slowly. Their hydraulics are precise, but inertial. The T-34 is lighter. The acceleration dynamics of the V2 diesel are higher than the gasoline Maybachs. That was their only advantage. Speed and maneuver against armor and numbers. A scalpel against a sledgehammer. The roar grew. Now individual sounds could be distinguished. The clank of tracks, the roar of engines revving. The ground transmitted vibration to the tank hull, and Sorov felt it through the soles of his boots. It was the tread of a giant, confident in its impunity. 47 barrels were already looking in their direction, though they didn't see them yet. The lieutenant checked the turret traverse mechanism. The flywheel turned stiffly but smoothly. The sector of fire was clear. He glanced at his watch. The hands inexorably counted down the seconds to contact. 11:25. The sun stood at its zenith, flooding the steppe with merciless light,
leaving not a single chance for concealment by shadow. The enemy's optics would work perfectly. No glare, no distortions. "Attention all crews," Sorov spoke clearly, enunciating every word to cut through the rising external noise and the internal fear of his men. "We will not work by the book. We will work by wits. Listen only to my commands. Forget about infantry tactics. We are cavalry. We are speed." He knew that a break was happening in the minds of his subordinates right now. They were used to linear warfare, shot, cover, shot. He was offering them chaos. But only in this chaos, in this insane equation with 47 variables, did they have a ghostly, mathematically vanishing, but still existent chance not just to die as heroes, but to complete the mission, to survive and win. The rumble became tangible. It seemed the air around the tanks thickened to the consistency of jelly. The first dust storm on the horizon began to take shape. Square, angular silhouettes of German 3s and 4s floated out of the heat haze. They advanced in a broad front, occupying all space, suppressing the psyche with their mere appearance. This wasn't just machinery. It was an ideology embodied in metal, advancing to crush 4 Soviet machines. Sorov took a deep breath of the stale tank air. There wasn't enough oxygen. Blood pounded in his temples, but his mind remained cold as ice. The analytical module in his head calculated the distance. 2,000 meters, 1,500, 1,000. "Get ready," he commanded. "Physics begins now." Darkness brought no coolness. Night over the steppe hung like a thick, suffocating blanket. Even after sunset, the thermometer showed 86 degrees Fahrenheit. The tank armor, baked during the day, cooled slowly, emitting characteristic clicks, metal contracting, releasing accumulated joules into the atmosphere. These sounds, like the ticking of a giant clock mechanism, were the only things breaking the silence in the platoon's position. Lieutenant Sorov sat on the rear deck of his T-34, leaning his back against the warm turret. Sleep was impossible. His body, exhausted by the day's march and nervous tension, demanded rest, but his brain continued to work at maximum RPMs, running through scenarios for tomorrow morning. He understood. If they met the dawn according to regulations, in stationary defense, they would be gone by noon. This wasn't cowardice, but the cold calculation of an engineer. A motionless tank in the open steppe against 47 barrels is an equation whose solution is always zero. Far away, beyond the horizon, the sky was periodically lit by pale flashes of lightning. There, to the west, the war was already ongoing, grinding up divisions. Here, in the collective farm sector, it was quiet for now, but it was the silence before an execution. Sorov took out a worn notebook and a pencil. The lead crumbled, leaving greasy, uneven marks on the paper. He tried to draw a defense scheme, but every time it looked like a scheme for a mass grave. Linear arrangement, death. Echelon formation, death. Ambush, nowhere to hide. His thoughts suddenly slipped into the past, to his pre-war childhood in Novaya Usman. Memory, defending itself from the horror of reality, pulled out a seemingly completely useless episode. He remembered how, as a boy, he watched an anthill that someone had stirred up with a stick. Thousands of insects rushed chaotically over the sandy mound. He tried to catch one specific ant, but it constantly changed its trajectory. A sharp jerk to the left, a stop for a split second, a jerk to the right, a zigzag. Hitting this biological point with a finger was impossible. The eye couldn't track the change in the motion vector, and the hand lagged in reaction. Sorov froze. The pencil stopped over the paper. The survival principle of the ant is chaos and continuous movement, Why should a tank be any different? A tank is 30 tons of inertia, but it is also 500 horsepower of diesel fury. What if you force this mass to move not linearly, not predictably, but in a closed loop, with a constant change of azimuth and speed? He began to draw. A circle, an ellipse, a figure 8. Tank Carousel. The term was born in his head instantly, by itself. The essence of the idea was simple to the point of genius and terrifying in the risk of its execution.
The tanks must not stand still. They must continuously circulate in front of the enemy front, presenting their frontal projection at sharp angles, making the probability of a ricochet maximum and the probability of a precise hit minimum. Alexander began to calculate. He knew the tactical and technical characteristics of the German fours by heart. The rotation speed of the Panzer turret is mechanical, slow. To traverse the barrel onto a target moving quickly on a transverse course at a distance of 500 meters, the German gunner needs to turn the hand wheel at a frantic speed. Plus lead time. A shell doesn't fly instantly. While the slug covers half a kilometer, a T-34 moving at 30 miles per hour will shift tens of meters. If the tank constantly changes its vector, the German gunner will simply lose his mind. His vestibular system and the mechanics of the sight won't be able to synchronize with the target. It was a duel of angular velocities. The speed of the German turret rotation against the linear speed of the Soviet tank. If Sorov could push his machines to the limit, to the howling of clutches, to the bloody calluses of the drivers, they would become invulnerable phantoms. The lieutenant feverishly covered the pages of the notebook with numbers. Fuel consumption, load on the transmission, firing intervals, firing on the move. Accuracy is low. That means a short stop is needed. Short is the key word. 3 seconds. Brake, fire, gas to the floor. Jerk, change position. The next tank pops out, fires, leaves. A carousel. A continuous wall of fire where every tank is a mobile firing point that disappears before the enemy has time to pull the trigger. Sweat dripped from his face onto the paper, blurring the lead. Inside the tank during the day, it would be 120 to 140 degrees. With hatches closed, engine running, and cannon firing, it is a gas chamber. Crews could simply lose consciousness from heat stroke and powder gas poisoning. Does that mean driving with driver's hatches open? No, shrapnel. Hatches on stoppers. Leave a slit the width of a palm. Fans on full. Sorov looked at his hands. They were black with oil and graphite. These were not the hands of a military strategist, but of a mechanic trying to fix the broken mechanism of fate. He understood that this tactic contradicted all the Red Army manuals of 1942. The manual demanded concentration of fire from a stationary position. He was planning to stage a circus on tracks. But there was iron logic in this circus. The T-34-76 is a maneuverable machine. Its element is dynamics. Wide tracks hold the ground. The powerful diesel tears off from a standstill. And German machines are heavy, wallowing. Their suspension is designed for shooting comfort, not for racing across rough terrain. They needed to force their own game on them. A game where the thickness of armor doesn't rule, but reaction speed and angular velocity of displacement. He imagined the face of driver Gromov when he heard the order. The old chauffeur, used to conserving equipment, would say they'd burn out the gearbox in 10 minutes of such a battle. And he would be right. The clutches would burn, the oil would boil. But better to burn the gearbox than to burn themselves along with the crew. Equipment is expendable material. People are not. Although war asserted the opposite. Sorov turned the page, drew a map of the terrain. Hill, slope, hollow. The carousel needed to be spun so that no more than 2 tanks were on the crest of the hill at the same time. Popped out, fired, went down into the dead zone for German guns. While the Germans reload and look for a target, the next one pops out onto the crest. To an observer from the other side, it will look like an endless avalanche of Soviet tanks. Psychological effect. Fear of the unknown.
The lieutenant closed the notebook. The decision was made. It was a risk bordering on madness, but it was the only chance to turn inevitable death into a battle. He looked to the east, where the sky was beginning to turn grey, heralding dawn. Soon the sun would rise and heat this world white hot. Soon the Germans would come. But now he had a plan. Not just an order to stand, but an algorithm of actions. An engineering problem that needed to be solved with the help of levers, optical sights, and human will. He stood up, stretching his stiff legs. The ticking of cooling metal had stopped. The tanks had cooled, ready to accept new heat. The heat of battle. Sorov shoved the notebook into his breast pocket, closer to his heart. There, on crumpled sheets of paper, was written the formula of their life. It only remained to prove its correctness in practice, where an error in calculations would be pierced armor and instant detonation of the ammo rack. He went to wake the crews. There was no more time for doubt. The countdown had begun. The morning smelled of spent oil fumes and damp earth. The sun hadn't yet burned the sky white, but the air was already thick and sticky. 4 crews stood in a semicircle by the commander's machine. 16 people, faces gray, sleep-deprived, etched with wrinkles into which indelible soot had eaten. They smoked hand-rolled cigarettes, hiding the embers in their fists out of old trench habit, although there was no point in hiding anymore. Lieutenant Sorov unfolded a map on the armor, holding down the corners with a wrench and a shell casing. He felt their gazes on him, heavy, evaluating gazes of grown men who were old enough to be his father. The driver of the lead machine, 36-year-old Ivan Gromov, spat black saliva at his feet and looked expectantly at the 19-year-old commander. In Gromov's eyes, one could read the fatigue of a man who had gone through the retreat from the very border and knew the value of young lieutenants fresh from the academy. Listen to the combat mission. Sorov's voice was firm, but inside everything clenched into a tight knot. The Germans will come in an hour. There are many of them. Our task is to hold the line. The crews were silent. These were standard words. Now the command should follow, "Mount up, prepare hull-down positions." The manual required burying into the ground up to the turret, leaving only the barrel. This gave protection, but deprived them of maneuver. "We will not dig in," Sorov said, looking straight into Gromov's eyes. The silence became ringing. Someone choked on smoke. Gromov slowly raised his head, his eyebrows creeping up, gathering an accordion of dirt and sweat on his forehead. "I don't understand, Comrade Lieutenant," he asked in a deaf bass. "We're going to meet them in the open field? Like on parade?" "Like in a shooting gallery," Sorov answered sharply. "If we stand still, we are targets. They have long-barreled 4s. They'll pick us off from 1.5 kilometers. We won't even be able to spit that far." "But the regulations," began the loader from the second machine, but Sorov interrupted him. "Regulations were written for war, not for execution. Listen carefully. We are going to circle." The lieutenant began to draw with his finger on the dusty armor. Circle, ellipse, figure 8, carousel. The first machine comes out on the crest. Short, stop, shot, go down, into the hollow. At this time, the second comes out. Shot, departure. Third, fourth. We will spin such a dance that the German gunners' heads will fall off from turning the hand wheels. Constant movement, constant change of position, not a second of static. Gromov stepped forward. His broad chest almost touched the lieutenant's shoulder. The driver smelled of diesel and old sweat. "Are you out of your mind, Commander?" He forgot about subordination, switching to informal speech.
What carousel? It's a tank, not a flea. 30 tons! Do you know what will happen to the main clutch after 10 minutes of such a dance? We'll burn the gearboxes to hell. The discs will sinter. We'll stall in the middle of the field with a seized engine, and then it's definitely over. And this way we'll die in 5 minutes. Sorov's voice broke into a falsetto, betraying his age, but he immediately crushed that rooster cry with will. Look at the map, Gromov. 47 tanks. 47! If you dig in, you will live exactly as long as their slug takes to fly. You want to save the clutches for the Germans? So they take a pristine machine with a dead crew. A murmur went through the crowd of tankers. We'll expose our sides, someone shouted from the back rows. On the turn, the side is naked. The armor there is cat tears, 45 millimeters. We won't expose them if we keep distance and angle.
Sorov slammed his fist on the armor. The sound came out dull and painful. We go at a tangent. Ricochet. Angular velocity. They won't be able to lead the target if we break the tempo. Gas, brake, shot, gas. It's death, shook his head the commander of the 3rd tank. It's madness, Lieutenant. They'll court-martial us for ruining the equipment, if we survive. I answer for the equipment, Sorov yelled, feeling his face turning red. I answer for your lives. Me! I have to write the death notifications to your wives. You want to live, Gromov? Or do you want to die by the book in a pit? Gromov was silent. He looked at the map, at the crooked lines drawn by a finger in the dust. He was a mechanic from God. He heard the machine with his backside. He knew the lieutenant was proposing violence against the machinery. The V2 diesel doesn't like such modes. The transmission doesn't like it. But even more, Gromov hated senseless death. He saw Sorov's eyes. There was no panic in them. There was frantic calculation and fear. Fear not for himself, but that he wouldn't be understood. Clutches, grumbled Gromov, taking out a new cigarette. His hands were shaking slightly. The oil will boil in 15 minutes. The temperature will be over 100. Then we'll pour water on the radiators. We'll piss on the transmission if we have to. Sorov grabbed Gromov by the oily sleeve. Ivan, trust me. It's physics. A moving target is harder to hit. We'll confuse them. We'll pull them apart. Gromov took a deep drag, blowing a stream of acrid smoke into the lieutenant's face. All right. He threw down the butt and crushed it with his boot. All right, engineer. You win. But if the engine seizes, I'll strangle you personally before I burn. Agreed, exhaled Sorov. Mount up, barked Gromov, turning to the crews. You heard the order? Hatches on stoppers, ventilation on full. Loaders, prepare to work like devils. Drivers, listen to my command. Don't spare the iron. Tear off from a standstill like scalded cats. The tankers, grumbling and cursing, reached for their machines. A minute later, the air was torn by the coughing sound of a starter. 1, 2nd, 3rd. 4 12-cylinder V2 diesels roared, spitting out clouds of blue smoke. The roar drowned out all doubts, all arguments, all fears. The ground under their feet trembled again, but now it was the trembling of their own power. Sorov climbed into the hatch. Inside, it already smelled of heated metal. He put on his headset, pressed the throat mic to his neck. The vibration of the hull transmitted to his spine. Now there was no way back. Only forward, into the carousel. Into the insane dance of steel and fire that a boy invented to save men. Check comms, he said. Platoon, listen to my command. Start the dance. Distance between vehicles, 50 meters. First one, go.
The tank jerked and tore off, raising a wall of dust behind the stern.
The clutches howled, taking on the monstrous torque.
Sorov looked through the periscope. The steppe lay before them, empty and waiting. The stage was set. The actors took their places. The orchestra of 47 German guns was preparing to join in. Engineering calculation entered into conflict with reality. Now everything depended on whether the gears and nerves would hold. No more words, only physics and death. 11:30. The sun stood at its highest point, turning the steppe into a red-hot frying pan. But the horizon suddenly darkened. It wasn't a thundercloud. It was a man-made storm, raised by thousands of steel tracks. Dust rose like a wall, blocking half the sky. Dense, greasy, soaked in the smell of unburnt synthetic diesel. The 14th Panzer Corps of the Wehrmacht was taking the stage. In the periscopes of the Soviet machines, only a grey haze appeared at first. The trembling air distorted the perspective, but soon the geometry of death emerged clearly.
They marched in a broad front, deployed in battle order, which looked more like a parade formation at the Kummersdorf proving ground. German Ordnung, order, was their psychological weapon. Straight lines, intervals measured to the meter. It was a demonstration of absolute confidence in their superiority. They knew that before them was emptiness. Intelligence had reported to them that the road to Stalingrad was open. First came the light threes, Panzerkampfwagen III, nimble, mobile reconnaissance and cover machines. Their short-barreled 50mm guns posed no mortal threat to the frontal armor of a T-34 at long range, but there were many of them. They were hunting dogs sniffing out prey. But the real horror walked in the second echelon. Alexander Sorov pressed against the eyepieces of the sight. The optics magnified the gray boxes, and the lieutenant saw what he feared most. Long barrels with characteristic muzzle brakes.
Panzerkampfwagen IV, modification F2. 75mm of death with high muzzle velocity. These guns punched through Soviet armor from 1,500 meters like cardboard. It was a hammer following the scalpel. 47 pennants. Sorov counted them automatically, although his mind refused to accept this arithmetic. 47 against 4. The armada rolled out onto the empty hill, occupying all visible space. It seemed the earth itself sagged under the weight of this metal. The rumble was such that inside the tank, even through the headset and his own breathing, the low-frequency rumble of alien Maybach engines could be heard. It was the sound of an advancing glacier grinding rocks. Ringing silence stood in the ether. None of the commanders of the Soviet machines uttered a word. All words were stuck in parched throats. Emotions were burned out by adrenaline. Only the animal reaction of the organism to mortal danger remained.
Below, in the driver's compartment, mechanic driver Ivan Gromov sat clutching the levers until his knuckles turned white. His right foot lay on the fuel pedal, and this foot was trembling. It wasn't cowardice, not panic. It was physiology. Muscles spasmed from the monstrous tension of waiting. Gromov looked through the narrow slit of the vision block, seeing the gray avalanche fill the world. His body wanted one thing: to press the pedal to the floor, turn the tank around, and leave. Run away, hide. The instinct of self-preservation, honed by millions of years of evolution, screamed that standing before this force was suicide. But reason held the foot suspended. The trembling transmitted to the tank hull, resonating with the vibration of the engine. Gromov knew, if he jerked now, if even one crew flinched, the formation would crumble,
and they would be picked off in the back like rabbits. He forced himself to breathe. Inhale, smell of diesel. Exhale, smell of fear. Inhale, dust.
Exhale, life. The distance was closing. 2,000 meters, 1,500. German turrets lazily moved their barrels. They were looking for targets, but saw only empty steppe and trembling haze over the crests of the hills. They didn't shoot. The Germans were saving ammo, confident there would be no resistance. This overconfidence was Sorov's only ally. "Comrade Lieutenant," rasped the loader. There was pleading in his voice. "They're going to us right now." Silence. Sorov's voice was quiet, but icy. Wait. 1,000 meters. Deadly distance for a duel. At this range, German Zeiss optics allowed placing shells in vulnerable zones, in the driver's hatch, in the turret ring. If the Germans opened fire now, the battle would end without starting. Sorov felt a cold trickle of sweat running down his back under his wet tunic. He was playing roulette, where the stake was the lives of 16 people. 800 meters. The gray boxes became huge. Now tactical numbers on the sides, spare tracks, jerry cans tied to the rear, could be distinguished. Commanders could be seen sticking out of hatches, carelessly scanning the surroundings with binoculars. They walked like masters. 600 meters. Nerves stretched like strings ready to snap with a characteristic ring. The gunner's index finger on the trigger twitched. The temptation to shoot was unbearable. To shoot, to relieve this monstrous pressure, to break the silence, to do at least something. But a shot from 600 meters into the front of a 4 is a lottery. Ricochet, non-penetration, and a return volley from 47 barrels would turn the height into a lunar landscape. "Distance 500, whispered Sorov, not tearing himself away from the sight. The crosshairs settled on the drive sprocket of the lead German tank. 400 meters. Critical point. Point of no return. At this distance, the 76mm shell of the Soviet F-34 gun retained sufficient kinetic energy to smash through German cemented steel. At this distance, it was impossible to miss. But impossible to survive under return fire either. Time compressed into one infinitely thin line. A second stretched into eternity. Sorov saw the German lead tank turn its hull slightly, bypassing a crater. The side opened for a moment. Ideal angle. 90 degrees. The driver's feet danced on the pedals. Hearts beat in throats, drowning out the noise of the motors. The air in the tank heated to the limit, but no one felt the heat. There was only the cold, piercing horror of the impending collision and the iron will of the order. Sorov inhaled. This breath could be the last. He saw the German commander in the lead machine raise binoculars to his eyes, finally noticing the camouflaged silhouettes on the ridge. Too late. The trap snapped shut. The silence burst. The command, "Fire!" did not sound in the ether like a scream. It sounded like the click of a switch closing a detonation circuit. In the same fraction of a second, 4 F-34 guns of 76mm caliber spewed flame. The tank shuddered with all its 30-ton body, as if hit in the forehead with a sledgehammer. The gun breech flew back with a clang onto the recoil stops, ejecting a smoking casing onto the floor of the fighting compartment. The ring of falling brass drowned in the roar of the shot, which hit the ears even through the headsets. 4 armor-piercing tracer shells went to the target with a muzzle velocity of 662 meters per second. A distance of 400 meters for such ballistics is a point-blank shot. Flight time? Less than a second. The German crews didn't even have time to understand they had been detected.
In Sorov's periscope, the picture of the world cracked. The lead German Panzer IV, moving in the center, stumbled.
The shell hit exactly at the junction of the turret and hull, the most vulnerable spot. A sheaf of sparks, looking like welding, blinded the optics for a moment. The multi-ton turret of the German machine jerked, jamming on the ring. The platoon's second shell found the fuel tank of a 3 following behind. The explosion of gasoline vapors tore apart the engine compartment, throwing a column of greasy black smoke into the sky. It was the first chord, a blow calculated not to destroy the entire armada, but to create chaos. The German formation, ideal, geometrically aligned, wavered. But Sorov didn't watch the result. Emotions of victory are a luxury they couldn't afford. Now the second part of the equation came into force: dynamics. "Gas! Move!" he screamed, losing his voice. "Let's go!" Ivan Gromov, deafened by the shot of his own gun, worked on reflexes. His foot pressed the fuel pedal to the floor until it stopped, and his hands yanked the steering clutch levers. The V2 diesel roared, reaching the limit of 2,000 RPM. The tank, instead of freezing to enjoy the effect of the hit, jumped. It literally jumped. 30 tons of steel broke away with the grace of a frightened beast. The tracks bit into the dry ground, tearing out chunks of earth and creating a dust curtain behind the stern. The T-34 rolled back into the hollow, behind the reverse slope of the hill. The entire maneuver took 4 seconds. In the same second, a return squall descended on the crest where they had just stood. The German reaction was professional. Their gunners spotted the muzzle flashes. Dozens of barrels turned toward the threat. Shells of 75 and 50 millimeter caliber plowed the earth, raising fountains of dust and shrapnel. But they hit emptiness. They hit phantoms. Where a second ago there was a Soviet tank, now there was only scorched grass and settling dust. The German war machine, used to fighting a stationary enemy, malfunctioned. The shells passed through the air, meeting no resistance from armor. "Second position!" Sorov's voice in the headphones sounded against the background of the growing roar of the transmission. "Left flank, 50 meters! Out!" Inside the tank, it was a hell of centrifugal force. The loader, trying to get a new shell from the rack on the floor, barely kept his feet. The tank was tossed on bumps. Gromov didn't spare the suspension. The springs of the Christie suspension compressed to the limit, the hull banging against the bump stops. The clang of metal, the roar of the engine, the smell of burning, everything mixed into a single sensory storm. 10 seconds later, 4 Soviet tanks flew out onto the crest again, but 50 meters to the left of the previous point. For the Germans, this was a violation of the laws of physics. They expected a second shot from the same place, or saw dust in the hollow, but simply did not expect the appearance of the enemy from the flank. The turrets of the German fours began to turn slowly, agonizingly slowly, toward the new threat. The electric turret traverse of the Panzer IV provided a speed of about 14 degrees per second. This was fast for positional warfare, but catastrophically slow for a duel with a Carousel. Sorov saw in the sight how the long barrels of the enemy crawled toward them like the hands of a giant clock, counting down the time of their lives. But he had a head start. 3 seconds. The German tanks exposed their sides. They were turning toward the first position, opening vulnerable side armor only 30 millimeters thick to the new Soviet attack vectors. "Short stop!" commanded Sorov. Gromov hit the brakes. The tank dipped its nose. The oscillation of the hull, the scourge of the T-34, could throw off the aim. But the gunner knew his business. He caught the moment at the bottom point of the oscillation amplitude. Fire! Another volley.
4 shells hit the sides of the German wedge. The effect was terrible. Thin side armor didn't hold the blow of a 76mm slug. One of the German tanks flared up instantly. The ammo rack detonated. The heavy turret was torn off the ring and thrown several meters to the side, like a lid from a boiling pot. Another tank lost a track and spun in place, exposing itself to the fire of its own comrades. "Back! Into cover!" Sorov shouted again. And again a jerk. The engine howled on a note close to ultrasound. The oil in the transmission heated up, the clutches began to slip, filling the fighting compartment with acrid blue smoke of burning friction material. But they moved. They lived. The German formation fell into confusion. Machines coming from behind began to break, crashing into the smoking wrecks of the front ones.
Someone tried to turn around. Someone reversed.
Precise geometric Ordnung turned into a pileup on a country road. Wehrmacht commanders shouted into radios, trying to understand how many Russian tanks were in front of them. Judging by the intensity of fire and change of positions, it seemed to them that they were being attacked by at least a full tank company. They couldn't believe that this chaos was created by just 4 machines darting along the crest of the hill like mad pendulums. Sorov wiped the sweat flooding his eyes. His heart pounded somewhere in his throat, making it hard to breathe. Fear was gone. Only the cold excitement of a gambler and the hard calculation of an engineer remained. He saw the German barrels hitting emptiness again, blowing up the earth where they no longer were. "Third position," he rasped. "Right flank. Don't let them recover. Spin them." The carousel gathered speed. Now it wasn't just a shootout, it was a rhythm of life and death.
Strike, leave. Strike, leave. A mechanical ballet, where a mistake was not a missed beat, but a crew burned alive.
Below, in the engine compartment, the oil temperature crept toward the critical mark of 221 degrees. But there was no time to look at the gauges. The steel flywheel of war had spun up, and only death or victory could stop it. The battle ceased to be a sequence of events. It turned into a centrifuge where time, space, and human physiology mixed into a single, inseparable mass. What began as a tactical experiment transformed into an insane, monotonous, and deadly, dangerous conveyor belt. The mechanics of the carousel reached design capacity. To an outside observer, if one could exist in this hell, what was happening on the crest of the hill looked like a violation of the laws of logic. 4 Soviet T-34 machines didn't just shoot, they flickered. A tank popped out onto the line of fire for exactly 4 seconds.
That time was enough for the gunner to catch the grey silhouette in the crosshairs, press the pedal release, and feel the 76mm gun throw the breech back. And in the same second, even before the casing hit the floor, the driver was already yanking the levers toward himself. The tank dived back into the cloud of its own dust, disappearing from German sights. And 50 meters away, to the left or right, another one was already flying out. For the German crews, this created a complete illusion of a massive attack. In their optics, muzzle flashes appeared everywhere, on the flanks, in the center, again on the flanks. German commanders screamed in the ether about a battalion of Russian tanks. They couldn't believe that this squall of fire was generated by just 4 crews working at the limit of human and technical capabilities. Inside the combat vehicles, the atmosphere ceased to be suitable for biological life. The thermometer in the fighting compartment of Lieutenant Sorov's tank went off the scale past 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The red-hot breech of the gun worked like a huge oven. The fan on the turret roof hummed, but it circulated not air, but a mixture of powder gases, carbon monoxide exhaust, and fumes of red-hot oil. The loader, a 20-year-old guy from near Ryazan, no longer wiped away sweat. Sweat flooded his eyes,
corroded the mucous membranes, dripped from his nose onto the shells. His movements became automatic, devoid of thought. Open the breech block. Snatch a 13-pound shell from the ammo rack. Ram it home. Remove hand. Recoil. Throw the hot casing into the hatch. Repeat. Blood started gushing from his nose. Vessels burst from pressure changes during shots and monstrous heat. Blood mixed with soot on his face, got into his mouth, but he didn't stop. If he stopped, the rhythm would break.
If the rhythm broke, the tank would linger on the crest for an extra second. An extra second is death. He wasn't a human. He was an ammo supply function, an appendage to the loading mechanism. In the German radio traffic, which Sorov's radio intercepted, hysteria reigned. Panic screams broke through the crackle of static. Totentanz! Das ist Totentanz! Dance of death. The Germans, accustomed to methodical, chess-like order of battle, collided with chaos. Their formation broke completely. Heavy fours tried to maneuver, interfering with each other. They turned turrets toward a flash on the right, but while the barrel reached the needed azimuth, a shell arrived in the side from the left. The armada lost orientation. They shot. They shot a lot and viciously. The steppe around the height boiled with explosions. Fountains of earth flew into the sky. Shrapnel clinked on the armor of Soviet tanks like hail on a tin roof. But there were no direct hits. Not a single one. It was a victory of dynamics over statics. The German shell flew to where the Soviet tank was a second ago, but Sorov's math worked flawlessly. The tank was no longer there. It was in the pit, in the dust, in motion. The Soviet machines became ghosts, material only at the moment of the shot and incorporeal at the moment of the return strike. Gromov below, in the driver's compartment, worked like a man possessed. His tunic stuck to his body, becoming a second skin. His boots slipped on the pedals from spilled oil. The steering clutch levers were so hot they burned his hands even through canvas mittens. He didn't see the battle. He saw only a narrow strip of earth in the vision block, dust, and the back of death, from which he ran every 10 seconds. A continuous ringing stood in his ears. The roar of his own gun, the howl of the diesel at full throttle, the impacts of tracks on the ground merged into one monotonous vibration. Sorov stopped giving commands by voice. No one heard him. He kicked the driver on the shoulders with his boot. Left shoulder, left, right, right, on the head, stop. This primitive communication system worked faster than the intercom. They had been circling for 20 minutes. 20 minutes at the limit beyond which system failure begins. During this time, the platoon fired more than 100 shells. 7 German bonfires were already burning in front of the hill. Black, greasy smoke from burning Panzers crept along the lowland, making aiming even harder for the Germans. They fired blindly, into the smoke, into the dust, wasting ammo fighting the landscape. Sorov clung to the periscope of the commander's cupola for a second to assess the situation. What he saw resembled a surreal painting. The bulk of the German offensive had crumbled. Instead of a single armored fist, a confused crowd of steel boxes trampled before them. They were backing up. Paulus's great armada, which had crossed half of Europe, was backing up before 4 dirty, overheated machines, driven by men half dead from fatigue. But physics cannot be fooled. Metal has its fatigue limit. Humans can work on will. Machinery works only on the laws of thermodynamics. The radiators of the T-34s couldn't handle the heat rejection. The water in the cooling system boiled, turning into steam that escaped with a whistle through valves, adding moist stuffiness to the hellish heat inside the tank. Precisely at this moment, the rhythm of the dance of death faltered. A mechanical, treacherous failure that no tactical schemes could predict. The catastrophe began not with an explosion,
but with silence. In the symphony of battle, woven from the roar of diesels and the thunder of guns, a single note suddenly dropped out. Tank number 3, popping out onto the crest for another shot, suddenly jerked and froze.
The 12-cylinder V2 diesel, exhausted by extreme temperature regimes, choked on superheated diesel fuel. The high-pressure fuel pump, red hot to 212 degrees, stopped delivering the mixture to the combustion chambers. The pistons stopped. 30 tons of dead steel froze at the very top of the hill, against the bright sky, like an ideal target on a training ground. For the driver of the third tank, it was a second of absolute, chilling horror. He pressed the starter button, but the engine remained silent. Inside the machine, only the hiss of the pneumatic system could be heard. He was trying to start the motor with compressed air, but the tanks were almost empty. The tachometer needle fell to 0, the fans stopped, and the silence inside the fighting compartment hit the ears harder than a concussion. From the German side, this stop was noticed instantly. The chaos the Russians created with their insane maneuvering suddenly glitched. One of the fleas stopped. For the gunner of a German Panzer IV, this was a gift of fate. He no longer needed to catch angular velocity, no longer needed to guess the lead. The target became stationary. Lieutenant Sorov, whose tank at that moment was below, in the dead zone, saw this through the dusty periscope. He saw the turret of the nearest German tank stop searching and lock rigidly onto the frozen 3. The long barrel with the muzzle brake looked straight at the side of the immobilized machine. Distance, 400 meters. A miss was excluded. Time delaminated. Sorov understood. The third crew had no chance. The German already had his finger on the electric trigger. A second to refine the aim, half a second for the shell flight, and that's it. 4 people would turn into ash. "Gromov!" Sorov's scream tore his voice, echoing with pain in his larynx. "Right! Intercept! Full throttle!" Ivan Gromov didn't ask questions. He didn't see the situation, but he heard the commander's intonation. It wasn't an order. It was a scream of despair. The driver yanked the right clutch and pressed the fuel pedal as if he wanted to push through the floor of the tank. Sorov's Commander T-34 roared, throwing out a black cloud of smoke, and tore up the slope. It was a violation of all rules of ballistics and tactics to drive out under a barrel that is already ready to fire, to expose oneself. But it was the only variable Sorov could introduce into this deadly equation to change the result. Sorov's tank flew out onto the line of fire exactly at the moment when the muzzle brake of the German gun was enveloped in a cloud of gases. Shot. The German gunner didn't have time to react to the suddenly appearing obstacle. The shell intended for the stationary third tank met the sloped frontal armor of the lieutenant's machine on its path. The blow was of such force that the 30-ton machine rocked like a dinghy in a storm. Inside the tank, the light went out. The bulb shattered. The sound wasn't like an explosion. It was a monstrous, vibrating ring, as if someone hit a huge bell with a sledgehammer while you were sitting inside it. This ringing went through the body, resonating in every bone, knocking the air out of the lungs. Sorov was thrown chest first onto the gun breech. His vision went dark. The salty taste of blood appeared in his mouth. He had bitten his tongue. But his consciousness, trained by stress, recorded the main thing. The ammo rack did not explode. We are alive. The 75mm shell hit the upper frontal plate at a sharp angle. Designer Mikhail Koshkin, creating the sloped armor of the T-34, saved their lives at that moment. The slug, possessing energy capable of smashing through 100 millimeters of vertical steel, ricocheted. It traced a deep furrow, glowing from friction, on the armor, and went into the sky with a wild howl, leaving only a thermal burn and a dent on the metal.
3, go!
Rasped Sorov into the microphone, not hearing his own voice due to the ringing in his ears. On the crest of the hill, in a cloud of dust, the engine of the third tank finally sneezed. Once more. And with a strained roar, it started working. The driver of the third, wet with horror and sweat, engaged reverse gear. The tank, jerking, crawled back into the hollow, into the saving shadow. Sorov's machine rolled down after it. Below, in cover, a second-long pause ensued. The crews caught their breath. Gromov tried to light a cigarette with shaking hands, but the match broke in his fingers. He turned his head to the lieutenant. On the driver's face was a mixture of fury and admiration. "You're crazy, Commander," he said with just his lips. "You put us under a slug." "I put the angle," answered Sorov, spitting blood onto the floor. "Angle of impact. Cosine, Ivan. Ordinary trigonometry." But he was lying. There was no trigonometry there. There was pure animal risk. The instinct to cover one's own. Tank brotherhood, which is sealed not by regulations, but by a sound of a ricochet like that, which still rings in the head. Sorov felt his head. A lump. Nonsense. He looked at the instruments. Water temperature, 230 degrees. Oil pressure falling. The engine was working itself to death. But they were whole, all 4 machines. "Check damage," he commanded, returning to the role of cold analyst. "Third, what's with the engine?" "Fuel system overheat," responded the commander of the third tank, his voice trembling and breaking. "Cooled down a bit. Seems to be pulling." "Thanks, Lieutenant. I thought that was it." Stow the lyrics. Sorov understood that if they relaxed now, the adrenaline crash would cover them, and they wouldn't be able to fight. Battle is not over. The Germans will regroup now. They realized we are vulnerable. He was right. German pedantry had cracked, but not broken. The enemy digested the failure, drew conclusions, and was preparing a new strike. Now they wouldn't wait. Now they would come head-on. Sorov looked out of the hatch. Outside, on the armor, right in front of his hatch, a fresh furrow was displayed, a scar from a German kiss. The metal at the point of impact turned blue from the temperature. A centimeter lower, and the shell would have punched through the driver's hatch. A centimeter higher, and it would have taken the turret off. It was the edge, thin as a razor blade, the edge between life and loss statistics. And they had just walked along it without even getting cut. "Platoon, listen to command!" The voice returned, became hard. "We're changing the pattern."
Enough riding on the same rails. Now we work in pairs. Scissors. First and second from the left flank. Third and fourth from the right. Crossfire. They needed to break the template again. The carousel worked, but the Germans got used to it. Now a new trick was needed. A new turn of the spiral. The engines roared. The respite, lasting no more than a minute, ended. The tanks crawled up again, to the crest, to where the air was saturated with death. But now there was something else in this movement. Fear was gone completely. After you've heard the screech of your own death against armor and stayed alive, there is nothing more to fear. Only work remained. Heavy, dirty, male work of turning enemy equipment into scrap metal. Sorov closed the hatch. The darkness of the fighting compartment closed around him again, familiar and stifling. "Let's go," he said quietly to himself. Round 2. The thunder didn't stop immediately. It left in waves, like a tide, leaving behind a hollow, cottony emptiness in the ears. First, the German guns fell silent. Then the machine gun on the flank stopped working. And finally, the low rumble of Maybach engines dissolved in the hot air. Lieutenant Alexander Sorov, deafened, his face covered in sweat and soot, was still looking into the periscope. His hands continued to grip the handles of the commander's periscope, fingers cramped, and he couldn't unclench them. The picture before his eyes was blurred, but even through the cloudy prism of the glass, he saw. They were leaving. The German armada, having lost formation and arrogance, was crawling away. It wasn't a panic flight. It was a tactical retreat. The tanks of the 14th Corps of the Wehrmacht were firing smoke grenades. White, puffy clouds of chemical smoke rose like a wall, hiding the surviving machines. Behind this curtain, the strained roar of motors could be heard. The Germans were towing damaged equipment, those that could still be saved. But 15 machines remained on the field. 15 black, smoking bonfires scattered across the steppe. Some burned brightly, with the crackle of detonating ammo. Others stood as gloomy, charred skeletons, from whose hatches lazy blue smoke drifted. It was a graveyard of German ambitions, a company and a half of tanks, destroyed or disabled by 4 Soviet machines. Sorov tore his gaze away from the observation device with difficulty. He looked at his watch. The crystal was cracked, but the second hand continued its run. 14:23. He blinked, trying to comprehend the numbers. It seemed to him the battle lasted 10 minutes, no more. 40 minutes of hellish carousel. But the watch claimed that nearly 3 hours had passed since the first shot. Time, compressed by adrenaline into a tight spring, was now straightening out, hitting consciousness with the reality of the lived nightmare. Inside the tank, silence fell. The engine idled. Its vibration no longer seemed furious. It became tired, rocking. The fan continued to hum monotonously, circulating hot air. "Report status," rasped Sorov. His voice sounded alien, scratchy, as if he were chewing sand. "Second, intact. Track chipped but running gear normal. Third, normal. Engine heating but working. Fourth, order. Concussion for the loader, bloody nose, but alive. 4. All 4. It was a statistic impossible to believe. The probability of such an outcome, according to all firing tables and probability theory, tended toward absolute 0. But they were here. Standing on the crest, shrouded in dust, alive. "Kill engines," commanded Sorov. "All exit vehicles. Air out." The engines sneezed and went silent. The silence outside fell on them like a heavy slab. In this silence, the crackling of burning metal on the field and the chirping of grasshoppers in the grass, who didn't give a damn about human war, could be clearly heard. The hatch of the commander's cupola yielded with difficulty. It was jammed from a shrapnel hit or warping. Sorov hit it with his shoulder, scraping skin, and the lid swung back with a clang. Air burst into the cabin. Hot, 95 degrees, smelling of burning and death. But compared to the 140 degrees inside, it was cool. He climbed out onto the armor and slid to the ground. His legs wouldn't hold him. The vestibular system, exhausted by constant rocking and sharp turns, refused to define vertical. Sorov sat right in the dust, leaning his back against the track. The metal of the tracks was so hot, it burned even through the thick fabric of his breeches. People were spilling out of the neighboring tanks. They didn't walk out. They fell out like sacks of sand. Black, like miners after an emergency shift. Faces weren't visible, only masks of oil and soot, on which the whites of eyes and teeth shone white. Someone's hands were shaking. Someone just lay on the ground, limbs spread, greedily gulping air with their mouth like a fish thrown on shore.
Ivan Gromov climbed out last. He jumped from the frontal armor heavily, ponderously. His tunic was dark with sweat, wringable. He walked up to Sorov, swaying like a drunk, sat next to him. His huge hands, used to wrestling levers, now trembled slightly. He reached into his pocket, took out a crumpled pack of Bilmorkanal cigarettes, tried to pull one out, but fingers wouldn't obey. The cigarette broke. He swore, dirtily, intricately, without malice, rather with surprise. Took out a second one, struck a match. The flame danced, missing the tip of the cigarette. Gromov took a deep drag, closed his eyes, and held the smoke in his lungs as if it weren't tobacco, but medicine, then slowly exhaled a stream into the sky. He turned his head to the lieutenant. The mechanic's gaze was empty and at the same time filled with some ancient, heavy understanding. There was no joy of victory in this look. There was only the fatigue of a man who had looked over the edge and returned. Gromov said not a word. He simply extended his huge palm, black with fuel oil, and heavily, fatherly slapped Sorov on the shoulder. In this gesture, there was more meaning than in all citation lists and political officers' speeches. It was an acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the 19-year-old kid turned out to be right, that his crazy math defeated their steel death. Sorov looked at the field before him. Smoke from German tanks rose vertically up into the windless sky. Among the burning wrecks, small figures could be seen, German tankers, survivors of this hell, crawling toward their own. None of Sorov's crews reached for weapons. There was neither strength nor desire to shoot in the back of crawling, concussed enemies. The work was done. Physical devastation rolled in waves. Adrenaline left, leaving behind a dull ache in all muscles. The body reminded him it wasn't made of iron. Ears rang, face smashed against the sight stung, elbows bruised against armor ached. Alexander shifted his gaze to his tank. The machine stood wrapped in a haze of heat radiating from the armor. The paint on the barrel had burned off completely, exposing gray metal. Dozens of marks were visible on the turret and hull, scratches from shrapnel, dents from ricochets, furrows traced by glancing hits. The T-34 looked like a fighter who walked out of a back-alley brawl, beaten, scarred, but standing on his feet. Sorov took out a canteen. The water in it was warm, almost hot, with a taste of metal. He took a sip, rinsed his mouth, spat out black saliva. "Alive," he said quietly. "Not by the book, but alive." Gromov nodded, continuing to look at the smoking horizon. "We'll have to change the clutches, Commander," he finally rasped. And this domestic, technical comment sounded like the best music. "And the clutch discs. There is nothing left of them." "We'll change them, Ivan," answered Sorov. "We'll change everything. The main thing is that there's someone left to change them." The sun began to dip to the west, painting the smoke of fires in crimson tones. The day that was supposed to be their last continued. The steppe, pitted with craters and littered with scrap metal, slowly cooled. And in the center of this chaos sat 16 people who had just canceled fate's sentence, rewriting it with their will and speed. Much lay ahead for them. Repairs, reports, new battles. But these 40 minutes remained in the past, frozen in history as proof that intellect is stronger than any armada. The sun touched the horizon, painting the steppe the color of dried blood. The heat began to subside, but the earth still breathed the heat accumulated during the day. The wind shifted, pulling a nauseating, sweetish smell of burnt flesh and rubber from the direction of the German positions. Lieutenant Alexander Sorov sat on a shell crate, leaning his back against the track of his tank. He tried to clean his hands with a rag soaked in gasoline,
but the fuel oil had eaten into the skin so deeply it looked like a tattoo. Nearby, right on the ground, the tankers slept. They slept the dead, heavy sleep of people who had completely exhausted their biological resource. Ivan Gromov snored, arms spread wide, and his chest heaved as if he were still pumping air into a suffocating engine. The silence was torn by the strained howl of a motor. Not a tank, but a car. From the rear, raising a trail of dust, an Army Gaz-67 all-terrain vehicle was fighting its way to the height. The goat jumped over craters, growled on ascents. Sorov didn't even move.
He had no strength left for subordination. He knew who was coming, and knew why. There had been no communication for the last 2 hours, and headquarters had likely already written them off as total losses. Or worse, decided they had deserted, abandoning the position. The car braked sharply 10 meters from the tank. The door flew open, and the battalion commander jumped out. The major was clean-shaven, trim. His tunic, though dusty from the road, looked unnaturally tidy against the background of the black, oily rags Sorov's crew's clothes had turned into. A leather map case hung at the major's side. The very maps on which their platoon was just a tactical symbol, a pencil mark. The battalion commander walked fast, angrily, clutching a riding crop in his hand. An adjutant with a folder scurried behind him. "Sorov!" barked the major, stopping 5 steps away. "Why out of uniform? Why are the men sleeping? Where are the trenches?" The lieutenant slowly, leaning on the armor, stood up. His legs buzzed, knees bent poorly. He tried to straighten up, salute, but his arm was too heavy. "Comrade Major," Sorov's voice sounded like the grinding of rusty hinges. "The men are resting after battle." "What battle?" The major flew up close, his face twisted with rage. "There was an order. Take defensive positions. Dig in. Create engineering barriers. I see bare steppe. I see tanks in the open. Did you decide to gift the Germans the equipment? This is a court-martial, Lieutenant. Violation of orders in a combat situation. Sabotage." The battalion commander was screaming sincerely. In his world, in the world of staff maps and manuals, what he saw was a crime. Tanks stood not in hull-down positions, but on the crest. The earth wasn't dug up with full-profile trenches. It looked like negligence, bordering on treason. Sorov silently looked at the major's red face. He didn't care. The fear of authority beaten into him at the academy had evaporated. After you've looked into the muzzle of a German 4 from pistol range, a major's shout seemed something distant and insignificant, like the buzzing of a fly. "Look over there, Comrade Major," Sorov said quietly, and pointed with a black hand to the west. The major cut himself off. He mechanically followed the lieutenant's gesture. At first, he didn't understand what he was seeing. In the twilight, the steppe seemed just a dark patch. But then his eyes focused. Lights. Dozens of dim, flickering lights. These were burning wrecks. Black silhouettes of German machines scattered across the field in chaotic disorder. The nearest, just 300 meters away. The furthest, almost at the horizon. Smoke from them rose in vertical columns, propping up the darkening sky. The major froze. He lowered the crop. His gaze ran from one fire to another, trying to count. 5, 10, 15. Whose are those? He asked, and his voice wavered, losing its command metal. 14th Panzer Corps of the Wehrmacht, Sorov answered dryly, as if reading a lecture on tactics. Vanguard. 47 units attacked at 1400 hours. Repelled. Enemy losses. 15 machines destroyed or critically damaged. The rest retreated. The major slowly turned to Sorov.
Now he wasn't looking at a dirty lieutenant out of uniform, but at something that didn't fit into his world view. He shifted his gaze to Sorov's 4 T-34s, battered, scratched, with burnt paint, but intact. "And yours?" the battalion commander asked quietly. "Losses?" "Personnel intact. Concussions, burns, equipment operational, but requires major repair of transmission. Burned the clutches, Comrade Major." The major took off his cap, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. He was an experienced officer. He knew the specs of German tanks. He knew the specs of the T-34. He understood the arithmetic of war.
4 against 47 in an open field is death. But he saw life before him. "How?" He just exhaled. "You don't have a single trench here. If we had dug in, we would have died in 8 minutes," answered Sorov. "We maneuvered. Active defense. Carousel." "Carousel?" The major frowned, trying to find a regulation term for this word. "Tactic of continuous change of positions," explained the lieutenant. "Strike, retreat, firing from short stops. We didn't let them aim. We forced our dynamics on them." The major was silent for a long minute. He looked at the field, then at the map in his case. On the map, a straight line of defense was drawn. In reality, there was chaos that brought victory. He understood he should arrest Sorov right now for insubordination. But to arrest a victor who burned 15 German tanks without losses was impossible. It broke the spine of logic.
"You're either a genius, Lieutenant," the battalion commander finally pronounced, looking Sorov straight in the eyes, "or a lucky fool. I haven't decided yet." "I'm an engineer, Comrade Major. It was a calculation." "Calculation," chuckled the major. He reached into his pocket, took out a cigarette case, clicked the lid, offered a cigarette to Sorov. "Smoke, engineer." They lit up, tobacco smoke mixed with burning smells. "Write a report," said the battalion commander, calmer now, businesslike. "In detail. Scheme of the battle. Ammo expenditure. And write out this carousel of yours. Army HQ won't believe it. They'll say exaggerations. We'll have to send a commission to count the iron." "No paper," said Sorov. The major tore a clean sheet from his map case, handed it over along with an indelible pencil. Sorov put the sheet on the warm, rough armor of the tank. The pencil shook in his hand. Muscles still hadn't recovered from the tension. He began to write. The letters came out crooked, jumping. To the battalion commander. Report. At 1200 hours engaged superior enemy forces. Applied tactic of maneuverable fire. It was a dry document. It had no words about fear, about the smell of urine and blood, about how Gromov prayed with curses while wrestling levers, about how armor rang from ricochets. Only facts. Time, calibers, distances. Sorov drew a diagram. Squares, our tanks. Diamonds, Germans. Arrows of movement vectors. On paper, it looked like a complex math problem solved by an honor student. Spirals, loops, crossing lines of fire. The battalion commander watched over his shoulder. His clean, ironed uniform contrasted sharply with the lieutenant's dirty back. It was a conflict of two worlds. The world of staff geometry, where everything is beautiful and perpendicular, and the world of trench truth, where everything is dirty, crooked, but effective. "Clutches, you say?" asked the major, looking at the scheme. "Yes." "And discs need changing. And oil. Engines overheated. I'll send a repair truck with parts in the morning," nodded the battalion commander. "And a field kitchen. You must have gone completely feral on dry rations here." He fell silent, examining Sorov's profile. Just a boy, 19 years old, but eyes of an old man.
"You know, Sorov," said the major quietly, "if you had burned, I would have court-martialed you posthumously for violation of regulations. But this way, I'll recommend you for an order. The Order of the Red Banner. If HQ believes in this math of yours." "I don't care, Comrade Major," answered Sorov, not looking up from the sheet. "Main thing is they send parts. Germans will return tomorrow. They'll be angry." "They'll return," agreed the major. "But you knocked their teeth out. They'll crawl more carefully now. We bought time." Sorov put a period and signed, handed the sheet to the battalion commander.
The paper kept the black fingerprints of the lieutenant, the stamp of war that cannot be placed in any chancery. The major carefully folded the report, put it in the map case. "Rest, Lieutenant. Organize guard duty. I'll send infantry for reinforcement by morning." He turned and walked to the car. The adjutant jumped in after him. The Gaz turned around, blasting Sorov with a new portion of dust, and rolled away into the darkness to where headquarters, telephone communication, and relative safety were. Sorov remained alone. He stood in the middle of the steppe, clutching the butt given by the battalion commander. Stars began to emerge in the sky, cold, indifferent stars that shone over Stalingrad and over Berlin alike. He looked at his hands. They were still trembling, but now not from the tension of battle, but from emptiness. He proved the theorem. He survived. But he knew war isn't an exam you pass once.
It's an endless session where every next ticket can be the last, and retakes aren't provided. Gromov approached from behind. He wasn't sleeping anymore. Stood leaning against the track, also looking after the departing car. "Well, Commander, did you get chewed out?" he asked hoarsely.
"Promised parts, Ivan," answered Sorov. "And a kitchen."
"Porridge is good," Gromov nodded seriously. "And parts are even better. Without clutches, we won't dance tomorrow." They stood silently, two people united by metal and common fate. Around them, in the darkness, 15 German tanks cooled, monuments to their madness and their skill. Night was claiming its rights, giving a short respite before a new day that would again demand the impossible from them. The steppe dust of 1942 settled quickly, beaten down by autumn rains, but the scheme drawn with a trembling pencil on a sheet from the battalion commander's map case remained.
It went to headquarters, passed through the carbon paper of clerks, transformed into dry paragraphs of combat manuals. What was born as an act of desperation and engineering insight in a specific geographical point turned into a systemic algorithm. Already a year later, in July 1943, in the inferno of the Kursk Bulge, other lieutenants who had never heard Sorov's name were shouting into throat mics, "Carousel! Work the carousel!" Against them came not fours, but heavy tigers and panthers with frontal armor impossible to penetrate point blank. And the only way to survive for crews of T-34s again became dynamics. Flanking maneuver, shot, dash, change of position. The deadly waltz invented by a 19-year-old guy near Stalingrad became a standard survival tool for Soviet armored troops. Alexander Sorov didn't burn. Statistics, which were merciless to him in August 42, suddenly changed anger to mercy. He walked through the war like a needle goes through coarse fabric, leaving a trail behind but remaining whole. He burned twice, changed machines, buried friends, but reached Berlin. When the last salvos fell silent, he took off his shoulder boards with the same relief with which one takes off dirty, sweat-soaked clothes. He returned to what he started with, to blueprints. The former platoon commander became a civil engineer. The man who learned to destroy German machinery dedicated the rest of his life to creation. He built bridges and factory halls. His calculations now concerned beam strength and resistance of materials, not angles of armor penetration and shell trajectories. But war doesn't let engineers go just like that. It ate into the subcortex. Every night, closing his eyes, the elderly Alexander Sorov saw not peaceful construction sites, but that dusty, red-hot steppe. He felt the phantom smell of burnt clutch and heard the ringing in his ears. That very sound when a 75mm slug ricochets off armor 10 centimeters from your head. That was the price of survival. Memory working like a broken record. Decades passed. The world changed. Tanks became different, with composite armor, laser rangefinders, and ballistic computers. But the physics of war remained the same. Thousands of kilometers from the Kotlub Collective Farm, in a sterile, air-conditioned auditorium of the West Point Military Academy, on a white marker board, a tactics instructor draws a diagram. Red and blue markers squeak on plastic. Cadets in perfectly ironed uniforms look at the board. "Note this pattern," says the instructor in English, pointing with a pointer at the loops Sorov once drew in a notebook. This is a classic example of active mobile defense under conditions of enemy numerical superiority. We call this asymmetric dynamic response. Cadets diligently redraw the scheme into their tablets. For them, it is an abstraction, pure geometry. They see vectors, angles of attack, and kill zones. They learn this as a theorem that needs to be passed on an exam to get an officer's rank. None of them knows the name of Alexander Sorov. In NATO textbooks, this maneuver is impersonal, broken down into formulas and tactical standards. None of these well-fed young guys feel the smell of urine and blood that stood in the fighting compartment of a T-34. They don't know that these straight lines on the board were drawn by the lives of 16 men who just wanted to go home. They don't know about driver Gromov, who prayed with curses at his levers. Don't know about the temperature of 140 degrees that melted the brain. For history, only the dry residue remained. Efficiency, loss ratio, survival graph. But herein lies the highest justice of engineering art. The author's name may be erased, but the construction created by him continues to work. A bridge built by an engineer stands even if the builder is forgotten. Tactic invented by a lieutenant continues to save crews' lives in local conflicts of the 21st century, even if they never heard of Stalingrad. Intellect is the only weapon that doesn't become obsolete. Armor rusts, gunpowder gets damp, motors wear out. But the idea that speed and calculation can defeat brute force remains an eternal constant. Alexander Sorov proved this not with a dissertation, but with a battle. That day, August 23, 1942, he solved an equation with 47 variables. And the answer to this equation is still written in the tablets of military history, even if in small print in the footnotes. War is dirt. War is fear. But sometimes, in rare moments, war becomes the highest form of mathematics, where the price of a mistake is life, and the reward is not a medal, but simply the opportunity to see the next dawn. Lieutenant Sorov's tank carousel stopped half a century ago, but the inertia of this movement, the inertia of the human spirit and engineering thought, continues to turn the flywheel of history. The screen goes dark. Only a hum remains. Not the hum of motors, but the hum of time absorbing names but leaving the essence. And in this silence sounds the final, invisible conclusion. The winner is not the one with thicker armor, but the one who thinks faster.